Hey class, welcome to first short video on the Marshall Plan. This should supplement your Cold War reading in the YAWP chapter and also the Truman Doctrine speech that you'll be listening to next week. So the Marshall Plan of 1948, otherwise known as the European Recovery Program, was a $12.4 billion stimulus package for Western European countries who were devastated by the war. Backstory on that, and I would encourage everyone to read the Henry Luce American Century article that I handed out in class. Read the last page of that, where Luce talks about what is it going to take for the United States to make the 20th century the American century, where he talks about the economic priorities the United States needs to talk about. He says, we know perfectly well that there's nothing like a free economic system continuing in our country unless it continues everywhere else. Essentially what Luce is saying is you can't have capitalism in just one country. Well, why is that? I'm going to assume somebody says in class, it's because of the problem of overproduction, to which I will respond, brilliant answer. Yes, it is the problem of overproduction. Countries need to be able to sell their excess goods and absorb other countries' excess goods. This is particularly a problem for the United States coming out of World War II. After all, what had brought the United States out of the Great Depression? It was not the New Deal, it was spending on war material. As the war is now winding up, what is going to keep the United States from slipping back into another Great Depression? And the belief was that the United States was going to have to start exporting more goods to other countries. The obvious problem is that the countries that the United States exported most of its goods towards, namely Western Europe, were devastated by World War II. So the question was immediately, how can the United States help to telescope, fast-track European recovery? This is why the United States took a lead in forming the United Nations in 1945, but the economic foundations of the United Nations were laid at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, when the United States and 43 other countries came together to kind of lay out an economic plan for the post-war world. The United States took the lead in establishing the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, the International Monetary Fund, and a general agreement on treaties and tariffs. The goal of the GATT was to create free trade, lower tariffs around the world, IMF to stabilize currency, and the IBRD to provide development and reconstruction money towards war-torn countries. The United States understood that if Europe was going to begin to buy American again, they had to be rebuilt. They didn't have the money to do that, so the United States is putting up a lot of its own money to help telescope European recovery, with the hope that Europe would begin buying American once they were recovered, and this would, of course, help America's overproduction problem. The two problems for the United States after 1944 is one, the money provided to the Bretton Woods agencies was not enough. Europe was not recovering as quickly, or not as quickly as the United States needed. And second was, what place was the Soviet Union going to stand in Americans' way of reconstruction and development, particularly in Western Europe, as well as in other countries as well too. The United States, even though the Soviet Union was American allies during World War II, largely by the historical accident that Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and broke their non-aggression pact, the United States never trusted the Soviet Union, and of course the Soviets never trusted the United States. And so the post-war world was one characterized by a great degree of uncertainty. The British tried to convince the Americans in 1946 the Soviets were not going to leave Eastern Europe. Instead, they were going to threaten Western Europe. They were going to establish what Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain throughout between Eastern and Western Europe that would be a constant threat to invasion of Western Europe and the start of World War III. In 1947, as you'll be listening to next week, Harry Truman, President of the United States, will issue an address to Congress that has become known as the Truman Doctrine or the Containment Speech, in which Truman decides that the British are right, that the Soviets are going to threaten World War III, threaten Western Europe, threaten European freedoms, and threaten European recovery. And so the United States pledges to lead the free world. You'll be listening to that next week as a part of your discussion board for that week. You'll also be reading about this in your YAWP chapter. So what does all this have to do with the Marshall Plan? The United States pledges under the threat through George Marshall, Secretary of State, will deliver this speech and advertisement throughout the United States to prevent Soviet expansion into Western Europe. The United States needed to provide all kinds of development, technical assistance, essentially a stimulus package, as you see kind of advertised there, for European states to recover. And as they recovered, these countries then would be able to stand up against Soviet aggression on their own. This was seen as kind of a temporary injection of American cash to supplement Bretton Woods, help European recovery, help them to be able to stand against assumed Soviet expansion, but also help them recover so that they can begin buying American again. So what I want you to understand about the Marshall Plan is the way in which U.S. imperialism but U.S. altruism are kind of intermingled in this policy. First, the imperialistic dimensions of the Marshall Plan. Americans gave $12.4 billion out to European countries, including Germany, yes, our recent enemy. We did not give them money to spend as they desired or even as they needed. Marshall Plan money came with strings attached. The agency that gave these funds out to Europe had a slogan, "Trade, not aid." Marshall Plan money was not to help European states, say, feed or provide medical supplies for their populations. Rather, it was to begin rebuilding European infrastructure so the European businesses could begin to take off again. In fact, a lot of Marshall Plan money was earmarked, meaning European companies had to buy heavy equipment from the United States to begin rebuilding roads and buildings and bridges and all these kinds of things. So a lot of Marshall Plan money actually made its way back into the hands of American companies in this way. And so understand the United States directed Europe towards a particular kind of reconstruction and development. Second, Marshall Plan money was, if you read the Henry Luce address, he talks about America needing to send out all kinds of Americanizing agents, filmmakers, engineers, scientists, doctors. The Marshall Plan became an occasion to send American experts to Europe to essentially teach them how to do business, how to do consumerism, essentially to kind of reconstruct Europe along a particular way of life, namely the American way of life. You see that reflected in the cartoon there, he's finally getting the hang of it. Europe doesn't know how to quite conduct its own affairs, and so the Americans are going to help them out. And so European businessmen had to take classes under the Marshall Plan on how to do things like marketing and distribution. The Marshall Plan provided hundreds of films that were intended to teach Europeans to value an American way of life, an American way of life that was characterized by high production, mass production even, and high consumption as well too. An incredibly materialistic vision of the world, in other words, is being imposed in all different kinds of ways under the auspices of the Marshall Plan. Finally, the United States directed Europe towards, you kind of see in some of the Marshall Plan propaganda there, towards a particular kind of post-war order, one in which European nationalisms would be downplayed. Europe would work towards economic cooperation. This is something the United States believed Europe needed to move towards, and it's something that they were using Marshall Plan money and Marshall Plan propaganda to try to push the Europeans away from a strong sense of being British or French or German and towards being European and promoting economic integration along those lines. We believed that this would be best for Europe, but we certainly believed it would be best for the United States. It would make it easier for the United States to conduct an economic invasion, if you will, into post-war European markets. So those are the imperialistic dimensions. On the other side, though, we can look at the general altruism of the Marshall Plan. First, understand Europe asked for this money. European states came to the United States in 1947, 1948, saying, you know, we want to recover, we need more money to recover. They actually asked Congress for $22 billion. Congress ended up freeing $12.4 billion. But understand that this is money that Europe wanted. They wanted the Marshall Plan. This is what some historians have called empire by invitation. Yes, the United States acted in Europe in a heavy-handed kind of way after the war, but they ultimately were invited by the Europeans in to do this. So take that for what you will. Second, alongside the Marshall Plan, the United States did provide all kinds of food and medical relief. We did try to be, as Luce talked about in his article, the Good Samaritan of the entire world for Europe. And even today, the Marshall Plan is generally considered by Europeans as one of the greatest foreign policy accomplishments of the United States. Winston Churchill at the time called it the most unselfish act in human history. And so the Marshall Plan, for all of its imperialistic elements, was welcomed by the Europeans as an incredibly humanitarian act. Finally, while the United States is trying to direct Europe along a particular kind of recovery, namely economic integration, understand that that's something that the Europeans wanted to accomplish anyways. Ever since World War I, they had been talking about becoming a United States of Europe. After World War II, Winston Churchill would give an address in 1949 where he tells European leaders, we need to become the United States of Europe. They wanted a greater movement towards unity. They wanted greater economic integration. And ultimately, Marshall Plan money helped them move in that direction, particularly in 1957 with the creation of the European Economic Community, at the time involving only 6 states, but ultimately expanding out in 1994 to the present-day European Union. So for as much as the Marshall Plan was intended to impose a particular American vision on Europe, understand it's a vision that Europe ultimately desired. And that way, maybe the Marshall Plan fits less Henry Luce's heavy-handed vision of American influence around the world, and maybe more Henry Wallace's vision of America helping other countries achieve post-war plans, visions for themselves that they wanted, that the United States helped Europe kind of achieve its own dream. Let's see, should be moving along to another slide. Let's skip to the big point. Understand the way in which the Cold War allowed the United States to achieve its primary post-war foreign policy goal. Stopping Soviet expansion, stopping Soviet aggression after World War II was not our primary foreign policy goal. Our primary foreign policy goal was an economic one. How can we ensure the continued prosperity, the continued full attempt at full employment within the United States? That was through a policy of American economic expansion, and that involved European recovery. understand the way in which the Cold War provided a cover, if you will, for the United States to pursue this particular goal. Was the Soviet threat to Western Europe and to U.S. interests real? Yes. Was the Soviet threat of expansion into Western Europe and threatening U.S. interests imagined? Yes. Was it real or was it imagined in this particular instance? It doesn't matter. It was played up, the Soviet threat was played up by American policymakers during this time, both real and imagined, in order to justify the Marshall Plan in this instance. And the Marshall Plan kind of served these dual purposes, one of challenging Soviet expansion, one of trying to contain Soviet ambitions within Europe, whatever they might be, but ultimately the Marshall Plan accomplished this economic goal of helping Europe to recover more rapidly so that they could begin buying America again, and America could continue to enjoy the prosperity that it had rediscovered during World War II. So understand the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine, the leadership of the free world, how these served American economic interests, American domestic economic interests after the war. And we're done.